Somewhere between 5 to 12 to maybe 15,000 years ago, Saturn novaed, and our ancestors witnessed it and survived the catastrophe. Yes.
Saturn theory. Let's keep going on this. So I did one show already which essentially introduced kind of what the theory was, and then we went through the configuration portion of what Saturn theory represents. So really quick, let me go ahead and do a fast recap. All right, so Saturn theory is the theory that Earth used to orbit Saturn only thousands of years ago. Now, the date I don't have, all right? Now, that's one of the problems that we suffer from right now within this theory. I mean, we suffer dating problems in essentially all history, so I guess that, this is not a unique problem. I don't have an exact date to give you. However, right now, the main evidence of the theory, and also, like I said, in history, remember, chronology, like real chronology, real human history, just in general, it's not that old, right? We've covered things like the Dark Ages not existing, 1,800 years of history added to ancient Greek history, for example. So, the dating problem is not just a problem with respect, to a cosmological situation, in this case, Saturn theory. I mean, dating sucks for everything. We do not have accurate dates for any of the stuff right now that mainstream historians really love to claim that we do have dates for. Anyway, so Saturn theory posits that Earth orbited Saturn and a few other planets as well. I don't know how many planetary bodies either. We'll get into that in a sec. Anyway, the date. The theory essentially claims that Earth orbited Saturn, maybe 5, 6, 7,000, maybe 10, 12, 15,000 years ago. Now, initially that sounds insane, right? What do you mean we orbited Saturn, right? So the very first thing that it's important to remember is that Saturn, the way it looks now, it did not look like that back when we orbited it. When Saturn was essentially our original sun, Saturn was not a gas giant in the way we look at it nowadays. Back then, it would have been considered a brown dwarf star. Now, brown dwarf stars have very interesting and unique features. One of the things that a brown dwarf star has is that it has the ability to, in theory, nestle planets within its magnetic field, or within its plasma sheath, if you will. The reason why a brown dwarf can do this is because stars are not nuclear in nature. You have to discard the nuclear theory. Because don't forget, the thermonuclear theory is just that. It's just a theory. And if you go and you start looking at it, even on the surface level, you find almost immediately that tons of theoretical physics have literally been created just to make the thermonuclear model work. So it's already out there in left field as it is. Of course, mainstream has no problem with this because it's their theory. And their theories are always correct, and we are never allowed to question their theory. Their theory is trash. I don't know what else to tell you. When you have to inject a ton of theoretical equations to try and prop up a really garbage theory and concept anyways, there's a point to where you just have to move on, right? I mean, mainstream scientists right now that believe in the thermonuclear model and remain closed off to any other explanation are quite literally priests in the religion of scientism. I don't know what else to call them, because that is all they are. They have faith that their thermonuclear model is real. Okay. Anyway, the thermonuclear model is wrong until proven true, and we are nowhere near that. So the reason why I even bring up the thermonuclear model is because we have to understand and remember that when Saturn is in a brown dwarf stage, it is not being powered by, thermonuclear explosions going off every microsecond or whatever they've got going on right now. But instead, stars are powered by what are called Birkeland currents. Essentially, very quickly, we just have electricity flowing all throughout the universe, and it's everywhere. There are these currents of electricity that are called Birkeland currents. in these essentially invisible, well, not always invisible, sometimes we can see them actually, sometimes we can't. The reason why is because this particular state of matter is called plasma, or this particular representation of electricity is in the state of plasma. And what plasma is able to do, plasma has 3 different modes of existence. It has dark mode, glow mode, and arc mode. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep into this just because we have a lot to talk about and this is better discussed in a different show anyways, and I'm pretty sure I've done it. Regardless, there's fantastic material out there regarding Birkeland currents. Anyway, go watch the good stuff. This is not going to help you, or at least nothing I'm going to say right now is going to be anywhere near as helpful as some of the really good people out there. So just go Google Birkeland currents. Even Google can't hide this, by the way. Anyway, long story short, stars are powered by Birkeland currents. A brown dwarf star is just one of these representations of what we call a Bennett pinch or a Z pinch within this plasma filament, Birkeland currents. Essentially, what will happen is that the Birkeland current in certain spots, depending on the electrical environment that it is currently flowing through, has the potential to essentially pinch in on itself and collapse down into a concentrated point of energy, a concentrated point of electricity. When it concentrates in that little area, depending on what's going on with the Birkeland current and the electrical environment that this point finds itself in, it will determine what kind of star will form within that situation. So in our situation, we just happen to be orbiting a brown dwarf star, which is either the lowest electrical energetic star in existence or one of the lower ones. The point is that a brown dwarf star is not like our sun. Our current sun right now would be considered a main sequence star. And apparently like 90% of the universe, or 90% of the stars in the universe, are supposedly supposed to be these main sequence stars. However, brown dwarfs are on the opposite end of the spectrum. I mean, not completely on the opposite end, but on the lower side of the energy spectrum here. The problem with that means that a brown dwarf does not glow like our sun does. It's a completely different situation. So to make the claim that 90% of stars are out there are main sequence stars, that might be inaccurate because brown dwarfs can be difficult to spot because they do not emit light anywhere near a main sequence star. So it's entirely possible that there are just infinitely more brown dwarfs out there than there are main sequence stars. We just can't see them. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that Saturn would have been a brown dwarf being powered essentially by electricity, all right? Just on the basics of everything. This is important to remember, or important to know, because Saturn theory does not work without plasma. All right. And in fact, I mean, the reality is nothing in this universe works without plasma. And of course, the mainstream continues to ignore this entire situation. For example, it was discovered quite a while ago that 99.9% of the universe is not composed of dark energy and dark matter, but it is composed of plasma. That's all it is. It's literally, they discovered that a while ago. NASA and all the other cosmologists, they just refuse to see that. Anyway, everything is essentially electric. The reason why we have to keep this in mind is because we are going to need the electromagnetic force to explain the physics about why and how all of the events that took place during Earth's recent history could have taken place. So right now, the mainstream, they rely on gravity to define all the major motion of the universe. Now, well, that's not true necessarily anymore, because what they discovered is that gravity does not explain all the observations that we are making right now in the universe. And yeah, I know we're supposed to get to Saturn theory and what happens next, but we really do need a foundation. And okay, and I won't do this next show. How about that? All right. Anyway, so really quick, what happens is that, or what happened is that mainstream cosmologists discovered that galaxies spin too fast to allow gravity to hold them together. So essentially, right now, galaxies are spinning way too fast and really should not exist if gravity was the only major player that was driving the universe. So they had to come up with something called dark energy and dark matter. This is a purely theoretical concept, and it's complete garbage because it's completely unnecessary. Now, of course, right now they have no evidence whatsoever that dark matter and dark energy exists, right? They say they're running experiments, but, they found literally nothing at this point in time, and they never will because there's nothing out there, right? It's just like trying to prove God. The scientists, the mainstream scientists right now who believe in dark energy and dark matter are literally in the exact same position as your average priest, right? They both believe in something that quite literally does not exist. So far as we can prove scientifically anyway, right? I'm not getting down on all of you religious people. I love you guys too. Don't worry about it. I think it's great that you believe in something. Keep doing it. I have no problem with that, right? We just, an atheist, it's fine, but just don't be militant either side. Okay. Anyway, so it's really important to understand that mainstream's, adherence to the gravitational theory driving everything has now been destroyed, not only by other theories, but in their own theories as well. So they've had to make up all this weird matter and weird energy. So that direction is obviously scientifically incorrect. Now, the good news is that we have all kinds of evidence that potentially proves is proving what is actually going on in the universe. Anyway, Saturn theory does not rely on gravity for all of the events that take place. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that gravity does not exist. As far as we can tell at the moment, gravity exists, but it is just a kind of representation of electromagnetism. And I'm not going to get into all of that. And that's, anyway. So I'm not getting rid of gravity is what I'm trying to say. All right. Now, we're going to be relying on electromagnetism to explain all of the events that take place cosmologically that the Saturn theory proposes happened to Earth only a few thousand years ago, or 10,000 maybe, whatever, you get it. The beautiful part of electromagnetism is that electromagnetism does a couple of things for us. The first and most important aspect of electromagnetism is how powerful it is. It's hilarious that mainstream people completely ignore the electromagnetic force, even though they admit that it exists out there in the universe. They just push it aside because, of course, this ruins their entire existence. The electromagnetic force is 10 to the 36th power, stronger than gravity. That is huge, and that changes everything, because if we have that kind of a force acting in the universe, suddenly we don't need things to take millions and billions of years to happen. Once we stop blaming gravity for stuff or trying to use gravity to explain everything we see out there, and we instead use real science, which shows that the electromagnetic force is what is driving everything out there in the universe, suddenly everything changes. Once we factor in electromagnetism, all of these cosmological processes no longer need billions of years to happen. Things can happen very quickly now. And it's simple science, right? The stronger the force, the more power that can be employed, the more things and quickly things will move. I don't know what else to state. I mean, it's literally that simple. Anyways, Saturn theory requires this. The reason why Saturn theory requires this is because of what happens where we left off in the last Saturn theory show. All right, so Saturn is not a gas giant at this stage in time. Saturn is a brown dwarf. Within the brown dwarf's electromagnetic field, we find multiple planetary bodies orbiting within that brown dwarf plasma sheath. Now, because brown dwarfs, they're not hot relative to star temperatures, Earth can orbit relatively close to this situation and not have any problems staying alive. In fact, not only does Earth not have any problems, or I should say the life on Earth has no issue staying alive, this particular environment is actually incredible for harboring life. Because what's happening is that Earth is essentially being radiated with a a uniform glow of radiating energy, or heat, I should say. Not in the sense of like you go out to the desert here on Earth kind of heat. No, I mean like if you just go to a temperate climate. anywhere on the planet would have been receiving uniform radiative heat. So that means no seasons. Nobody's going to have any problems, looking around for food, because food is literally growing all over the entire surface of the planet. One of the side effects, or one of the things that even mainstream cosmologists discovered relative to what brown dwarfs do is that brown dwarfs radiate water. Yes, they actually radiate water. So Earth is literally sitting here getting a very light mist of constant stream of water raining down gently, feeding all of the plant life, and of course keeping all of the animal life watered. You get what I'm saying? Basically, you have a perfect nursery situation. This, of course, lines up exactly with the golden age of everybody's ancient histories. Saturn, in this case, would be the creator god, you could say, that everybody worshipped back in the day. Because if you go back and you look at a lot of ancient histories, what you find Saturn iconography everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere. It almost does not matter the religion or the histories. Everybody has this very particular creator god. So if you're wondering why, people are not talking about the rings, because everybody knows the rings of Saturn, Saturn did not have rings at this point. Saturn is nothing. The Saturn we know right now looked nothing like our ancestors would have witnessed the planet. Now, in the last show, I didn't cover this, so I want to cover something really quick to show multiple perspectives on the theory. And I want to try that for other aspects as well. Okay, so right now, I imagine that all of you who are imagining Earth orbiting around a brown dwarf, you have Earth probably orbiting with respect to the brown dwarf star's equatorial plane. Now, that's an entire possibility, all right? So just like we orbit the sun now within the sun's equatorial plane, we could have been doing that as well around the brown dwarf. So I believe in the first show, we went over the south polar configuration of the planets potentially orbiting. Basically, that would be the pearls on a string analogy. You have, brown dwarf Saturn up top, and then essentially you have the Birkeland current, flowing straight through north-south poles, and then, Earth, Mars, and potentially other planetary bodies would have been strung along that Birkeland current as well, and everybody would have been locked into a south polar orbit, into one long line. Now, there's a lot of very interesting evidence that supports that is what may have happened. However, I personally am not, I don't see enough of it to truly make that claim 100%. There's some problems with that because not some of the histories, when you start to look back at a lot of the other ancient histories, we do find situations to where there are essentially circles within circles within circles. That is something that you would expect to see when you looked up, up to the sky. If you were on the North Pole of Earth, if you looked straight up, you would see Mars would have been above us. And then if there was another planet behind Mars, you would have seen, another circle behind Mars. And then you would have seen even further up north in the sky, you would eventually see, the spherical glowingness of the brown dwarf Saturn. So you would have, a sphere and a sphere and a sphere. It would essentially even look like a cartoon eyeball you could think of, right? And that particular formation does seem to have existed at some point in time. However, I'm not convinced necessarily that this polar configuration was the original configuration, simply because a lot of the histories don't really flow very well with this idea. So we run into a situation to where the planets are either in a south polar locked orbit, or they're orbiting within the equatorial ring of Saturn, or perhaps a mixture of both. The theory also has been presented that potentially Earth and the other satellites would have been orbiting in the equatorial plane, and then once the events that cause Saturn to nova kick off, once that electromagnetic environment shifts, all of the planets would have shifted from that equatorial plane down towards the South Pole to where they would have fell into that South Pole equatorial alignment, to where they would have created the pearls on a string. There's reason to believe that might actually have been the case because we have actually seen comets break up once they enter an electromagnetic environment that they are not going to survive. What we find is they break up into pieces and then they form literally multiple pearls on a string formation, right? The comet Shoemaker-Levy situation literally did that, right? It broke up, went into one long line, and then crashed and burned. So we do have observational evidence that something like this can and does happen. Not only that, but there's electromagnetic properties that would also support this kind of configuration as well. Anyway, so it just gets weird. This is one of those things I want to make sure that everybody understands. We are still trying to figure this stuff out, right? and really quick, before we go further, I know, 20 minutes into this and we haven't even started part 2, but I want to make sure we have multiple points of view of the theory because this is important. We don't have all the answers, so it's important, in my opinion, to look at other angles of the theory. Really quick, one other angle of the theory, or a couple other angles. So right now I'm talking in dates of this event taking place, say, between 5 and 15,000 years ago. Not that long ago. And there's very, very, very good reason to believe that those numbers are the right direction to go towards. But that does not mean that there are not alternative perspectives. So one of the other alternative perspectives about Saturn theory is more of a conventional kind of timeline. There are proponents of the theory who still believe in the millions and billions of years. So you will find some aspects of people throwing this stuff back, 200,000 years or 200 million years or whatever, right? They still try to latch on to the theory of uniformity to some degree or another, which is, it's just stupid because you don't need the theory of uniformity once you factor in electromagnetism. Electromagnetism is unbelievably amazing because of how powerful it is. You don't need those kind of time scales anymore. So if you guys go out there and you do start to look at other perspectives, and please do, you'll find that there are proponents that are going to throw this stuff back hundreds of thousands, if not, millions or hundreds of millions of years in the past. I personally, just following the evidence, I'm going with the thousands, maybe 10,000, 12,000 years ago dates, simply because that's what the evidence shows. I'm not going in that direction because I woke up one day on crack and I was like, you know what, bro, I think it happened like 10,000 years ago and that's my theory and everything I do from now on will have to conform to that theory. No, I'm not a mainstream scientist, so I would never do that. Anyway, you are going to run into all kinds of different dates. When you do run into those dates, just challenge them, right? Go see if you can figure out why they're making these claims the way they're making them. And more often than not, you are really going to run into those particular theorists simply not letting go of the theory of uniformitarianism. Don't forget, man, everybody has been so heavily psychologically conditioned with uniformitarianism. That kind of conditioning is tough to break. Even for people who are going out of their way to try to find the truth and who are taking something like Saturn theory seriously, you still find them mired, absolutely weighed down by their psychological conditioning. So just be aware that you will still be contending with those kinds of things. I realized to come to the conclusion that these events only took place a few thousand years ago, or 10,000 or whatever. I know that's shocking, but the science is what the science is. Okay, so those are the alternative theories, or some of them. We gotta move on. Otherwise, I will never get to what I wanted to talk about in this show. All right. One other thing to note, actually, that in my opinion is pretty important to keep in mind, and I don't really see anybody notice this, so I'm not saying I'm the first person, but anyway, just something to think about, is that the way Saturn theory is told with respect to ancient cultures' mythologies is very different relative to the way that later histories will be recorded. By that I mean, when we look back at something like the Venus event or some of the more recent catastrophes that hit planet Earth that our ancestors witnessed and recorded, we find those events recorded far more in a historical context Whereas the Saturn situation is recorded much more in a mythological context. So what I mean by that is that if you look at cultures who recorded the more recent events that took place, like the Venus event, potentially the Mars event, and some other cosmological problems that happened only literally a couple of thousand years ago, those histories are very much recorded as a history. As, you know, hey, people were able to sit there, watch this, and they didn't just mythologize it, they just recorded what they saw in the sky. Yes, they might have personified it and dressed it up a little bit, and things have, of course, changed, down the last couple of thousand years, so we're not getting the perfect version of the story. But those are recorded mostly as a historical situation, not so much as a mythological or legendary situation. When we look back at Saturn theory and we look at all the ancient cultures that have, the origins of Saturn baked into all of their creation stories, we find all of those stories told in a much more mythological fashion. So by that I mean, and a perfect example of this is essentially, think about Noah's flood, right? That particular flood is, for whatever reason, scattered all over hell and back all over this planet. If a culture has a history that goes back far enough, they have this exact same story. However, this story is not told with the historical detail or even the scientific detail that, say, more recent cataclysms contained. We find the Saturn situation really is told in a very weird mythological way. The reason why I say this is because of how similar the stories are across the planet. There's always a Noah-like figure associated with this story. There's always some kind of, humans were bad and evil, and then, of course, there's giants apparently as well. Everybody has these exact same stories, and there's not much difference to them. I mean, there are little bits of difference, but the main point is that these stories are not told from a geographical perspective. They are told very much like, hey, we heard this story from somebody, and this was just the story, and that's what we heard. We were not actually there to record this, so we're just recording something that was conveyed to us. In my opinion, this is the way the stories sound. Because if you look at something like the Venus event and the way our ancestors record the Venus event, they all record that event very much from a localized eyewitness testimony. So not everybody saw the mountain of water that was being rolled across the planet. Not everybody would have witnessed lands sinking or lands rising out of the ocean, because not everybody would have necessarily been next to an oceanographic area to which they could have seen such an event. It's a very interesting difference, in my opinion. And then if we want to take it a little step further, let's have some fun. What's even more interesting is that the cultures who record this creation and destruction event, the Saturn Nova situation, they actually say, hey, look, we were not there to see this. We received this story from travelers from the sea. We have a lot of cultures that have a certain kind of people show up. And the flood story, or the Saturn creation story, is one of the stories that these people tell the locals. Now, that I don't want to get too far into all of that, but isn't that fascinating? I don't know. It's just something I've noticed and I didn't see anybody call out. Okay. So, with respect to Saturn theory then being recorded the way it was recorded, what that means is that we do not have as great of an eyewitness testimony as we would really like to have, especially if we look at something relative to, say, the Venus event. Venus event, tons of people saw it, enough people lived to really record it, and it really wasn't that far away from our current year. So the information did not have that much time to be, or as much time to be changed and or deleted. So that's the advantage. The flood story, we don't have any of those advantages, at least not really that I have been shown. What we have is we have the mythology, we have all of the scientific evidence, and we're kind of trying to extrapolate from that the whole story of what happened here. Okay, let's get into the next part of the story. Jesus. Okay, so where we left off was this. We have the Saturn solar system, essentially. The Saturnian system, we'll call it that. The Saturnian system, Earth is orbiting that. We're all within the plasma bubble or the plasma sheath or the electromagnetic field, whatever you want to call it. We're all happy floating out in space. Now, what's going on is that we are floating and moving. What happens is that our brown dwarf Saturn will eventually make contact with our current sun. Now, remember, everything is electromagnetic out there in space. So, not only does Saturn have its own electromagnetic field, but so does the sun. We know that right now, right? Okay, so if the sun is out there floating around and it has an electromagnetic field, what happens when these two electromagnetic fields essentially touch each other? Well, this is where all hell is going to break loose. We essentially have two completely different solar systems which are electrically charged and have an electromagnetic field, and now we have two different electromagnetic environments that will begin to interact. Once this interaction begins within the electromagnetic sheaths of the two solar bodies, I guess we could say, this is where everything is going to collapse. This is where all of these insane events that are discussed in creation stories are going to be born. Now, let's really quick talk about the sun's solar system at the time. And I'll just call it, I guess, Sol. Should we call it the Sol system? That's kind of lame. I don't know. We'll just call it the sun system. For now, I'll call, Saturn is our current sun in this story. The sun's solar system will remain the way we think of it now. Okay. Or not the same. I mean, it's not the same, back then as it is now, obviously, because we were not part of the sun. You know what I mean? Shut up. Okay. Basically, what I mean is the sun's solar system would have been different than what it is today. Now, I don't know what kind of star, for example, perhaps the sun may have originally been before Saturn runs into it. The reason why is simple. Remember, when Earth is contained in that plasma sheath, we cannot see outside. So our ancestors at this point in time in history actually have no concept of stars. They understand planets because they could see Mars, for sure they could see, and I don't know what other planets they potentially also could have seen because everything gets scrambled and goes crazy. But our ancestors would have no concept of stars. So as we're approaching the sun in our happy little brown dwarf solar system, we don't know we're approaching the sun. Our ancestors would not have seen what was coming. So this is also another problem, by the way. So anybody who would have been trying to record this event on Earth, you're blind to a lot of stuff. So, for example, you would have been blind to any planetary bodies that may have been orbiting on the North Pole aspect of Saturn. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know for sure if there even were planets up there, but if there were, we would not have seen them, for example. If we tried to look out and tried to look at the sun, getting ready to collide with us, we wouldn't have seen anything. Apparently, what we would have constantly seen everywhere would have been a nice light purple reddish glow from the plasma sheath of the brown dwarf Saturn. So your vision would have been incredible. I mean, you would have seen Saturn really close to you, by the way. That's another thing I don't think I mentioned. These planetary bodies, they were not far away. Don't think of us orbiting around Saturn the way we orbit around the sun now. What I mean by that is right now all the planets are very much spaced way far apart, right? It takes forever to get anywhere in our solar system. The Saturnian system was not like that. It seems like our ancestors could literally look and see Mars perhaps even larger than the way we see the moon now. And they may have actually been able to see other planets as well. I don't know. But that's one of the things that they discuss in their histories. And we'll talk about that on a completely different show one day. So just remember, this whole situation is absolutely alien. Anything you think you know about the cosmos, you have to kind of throw away because our ancestors were not living in the kind of universe that we live in now. By that I mean our environment is 100% different than what our ancestors lived in. And that makes sense if we read their stories, because we have stories of when the stars finally show up, don't we? Yeah, we do. We have cultures talking about that. We have stories of times to where there was no problems, nobody worried about anything. There was no such thing as hatred or greed or any of that crap, and you could easily have that kind of a situation if the planet was just plentiful with everything you would ever desire, so it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't even make sense to have hatred or greed, right? And that's what, once again, everybody describes. You can actually have that kind of a psychological situation if you have humans living in a time to where they want for nothing and the concepts of like hatred, greed, whatever don't exist. In fact, that's actually one of the reasons why, if you listen to the religious aspect of the stories, why this happens, right? They were punishing humans. They were punishing giants. They were trying to wipe the earth of all the evil stuff that had been injected into humanity at some point in time during the Golden Age. Anyway, also a different story. But very interesting how all of this fits together, doesn't it? With the science and the history. Okay, anyway. Regardless of perhaps the artificial reasons why what happens does indeed happen. Now, back to the configuration of the sun's solar system during this period of time. So we don't know. So basically, yeah, we have no idea. The only thing that we probably have a good grasp on would be this. The sun existed in some capacity, and Jupiter would have been the sun's binary star. Now, I don't know what configuration Jupiter would have been in during this period of time. Could have been another main sequence star, perhaps. Could have been a red dwarf. Probably was not a... Well, it could have been a brown dwarf, potentially. Anyway, that is up for debate. Anyway, the main point is that it appears that in this period of time, there was a Sun-Jupiter binary system. Did it have other planetary bodies rotating about the systems? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. This is one of the problems that might have a few solutions, but it's very interesting to think about that the sun we have now may have had other planets that harbored life to some degree or another, and those planets are either now scorched Earth or they were obliterated during the Saturn event, right? So it's crazy stuff to think about, but it's funny when you look at our solar system now. I mean, our solar system really does reflect all of this horrific stuff that happened in the past, and we'll get to that over time. Okay, so we have our two solar systems, and their electromagnetic fields begin to interact with each other. What happens when two oppositely charged, with various kinds of charges, objects come into contact? A couple of things. The first thing that happens is that they attract, right? Remember my magnets in the first episode. What happens when you have two magnets, oppositely charged, obviously, and you let them go close to one another? They zoom into each other and they snap together. They do that because the electromagnetic force is incredibly powerful. No gravity needed to have any of this happen. So that magnet example is essentially what is going to be happening to the Sun-Saturnian system. These two systems, oh, and by the way, I believe the Sun's system would have been positively charged, and the Saturn system would have been negatively charged. And there's scientific reasons to believe that. Anyway, so two opposite things, they start to attract. But what else happens when you have differential charges in charged bodies that are now interacting? Well, what happens is exactly what our ancestors say happened. So electricity does not like to be at a high potential. Electricity will do everything that it can to get to the lowest point of potential energy. And it will go any path it needs to take to do this, right? So this is the key to understanding what happens between these two solar systems. Now, once these electromagnetic fields begin to interact with one another, the electricity begins to flow. The process of electricity trying to get to a point of lower potential energy is what is going to cause all of the insane, chaotic catastrophes that everybody goes through, and that some people were apparently able to survive and at least carry on down through some sort of a mythological or legendary story. So, as these two bodies are now touching, they're starting to attract one another in. So, whatever original trajectory these guys had, that stuff is gone. They're stopping, and now they're starting to approach one another. As these two electrically charged bodies begin to approach one another, everybody starts shedding charge. Now, remember, when I told you we have two potential orbital situations with respect to the Earth orbiting Saturn, it was either, or we were already either locked at a southern polar orbit, or our orbit may have been in the equatorial area of Saturn, and then once this event kicked off, once the electrical environment began to change, it's entirely possible then that Earth and all the other planetary bodies shifted from the equatorial area down to the South Pole. And I suppose, and I wonder if other planetary bodies could have shifted up to the North Pole. I don't have an answer for that, and I don't think I've seen anybody mention that. Just an interesting question. Actually, if anybody has any information on that possibility, I would love to hear it. Anyway, so this is where the configuration, we don't know the original configuration, maybe. All right, so remember, we don't have all the answers yet. Anyway, so once Saturn starts to shed charge, and of course the sun is also acclimating to Saturn's charge, what happens to Saturn is that electromagnetic field that was protecting Earth begins to change. When the electromagnetic field of Saturn begins to change, that reddish, bluish, purplish hue that used to blanket Earth, that was radiated off of the brown dwarf Saturn, that starts to disappear. We actually have ancient stories of this exact situation happening. When we look back at history, we find everybody in creation talking about the waters of creation, the milk of creation. There's always some kind of a liquidy mass in creation. That liquidy looking mass that everybody is describing as water or liquid is just plasma that everybody was seeing in the sky generated by Saturn. This liquidy substance, the plasma, will now start to disappear as the brown dwarf Saturn begins to change its electrical environment. This is where you will start to find stories from all around the planet with respect to the Saturn story of the stars starting to come out of the Milky Sea or the waters of creation or whatever liquid, whatever culture is using. Yeah, pretty cool, huh? Suddenly all these stories that sounded insane, now they start to make a little more sense. And even more interesting, it's a scientific sense. That's the best kind of sense. Oh, really quick, another question that I have, and it's something that I have not seen a satisfactory answer on yet either, is that before the Saturn event takes place, I believe it's the Sumerians, Anu, right? Anu is a Sumerian god. Anu is like one of the ultra creators. But Anu, for whatever reason, is described really even further back than the Saturn situation that takes place. Because remember, Saturn is essentially Anu's child. I'll just say child. We find Anu is related to Uranus. And I have no idea where Uranus is, for example, in all of this Saturnian chaos, just so everybody knows. I don't know where Uranus is, and I don't know where Neptune is during these events. I have not seen anybody lock those two planetary bodies down. However, the Sumerians do make note that Uranus gave birth to Saturn, apparently, which doesn't make sense to me. And then, Uranus would be Anu, by the way. And then, of course, in that story, Anu is only there kind of at the beginning, and then Anu drifts away and doesn't really matter anymore. So Uranus, very interesting planet. I have no answer for where the hell that was, and I have no idea what Neptune was doing either. So those are some things I would love to find information on as well. Anyway, as the electrical environment begins to change with respect to both the Sun's solar system and Saturn's solar system, all hell breaks loose. So what's going to happen is that brown dwarf Saturn is going to start losing its charge to the Sun. So the reason why we lose that plasma sheath is because the brown dwarf Saturn is now being transmuted into a far lower energy state, which will eventually end up being the gas giant that we know as Saturn now. If you look at the gas giants, both Saturn and Jupiter, and what you find, and even the mainstream will talk about this, is that those two gas giant bodies have all the properties necessary for a star. You will even find mainstream cosmologists say that Saturn and Jupiter may have been failed stars. There's no such thing as a failed star. There's just different energy states or different Bennett or Z-pinch states within a Birkeland current. What we are seeing right now is a very low energy state, or what we're seeing right now with respect to Saturn and Jupiter is just a very lower energy state of a star. So you can still actually maybe even get away calling them stars, maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, all the properties are there, and even the mainstream acknowledges this. It's absolutely amazing what the real science tells us, and it's completely ignored by the mainstream. It's hilarious. Anyway, so Saturn starts to shed its charge. As it does this, all of the planets that are orbiting Saturn at this point in time will start to be tossed around to one degree or another. Their orbits are going to change. Their distances from Saturn are going to start to change. Don't forget, the planets themselves have electromagnetic fields as well. So planets are also going to start reacting to their new electrical environment. Planets are even going to eventually start shedding charge as well. All right, so let's look back over to the Sun's solar system. So Saturn draining charge, Sun absorbing charge. The Sun-Jupiter system, they are also going to start going through changes. Now, I can't really provide too much information, or I can't provide really any information on this if you think about it, because nobody, A, could see what was going on in the first place, and B, we don't know the original states of what Jupiter and the Sun were. So it's hard to say what could have happened. The only thing that we know for a fact is that the Sun's binary solar system was definitely much more powerful than the Saturnian one. So, Saturnian solar system is now being dragged towards the Sun. Everybody is starting to shed charge to acclimate to their new electric environment. As this starts to happen, the planets are going to go through a roller coaster ride. And during this period of time, I would not be surprised if you had other planetary bodies up there that we just don't know ever existed. They could have been ripped to shreds by some of these electromagnetic events. And more than likely, they probably were. I mean, like I said, I can't prove it either way. Just throwing it out there so that if you guys are reading texts that are maybe lesser known, and you guys are finding other names and possibly planetary bodies with relation to the world's first ultra flood, you might actually be making discoveries about other potential planetary or cosmological bodies that we don't know about right now. So it's really important to pay attention to this. You right now, you sitting there, you could make that discovery. So do it, because I'm way too lazy to do. I could talk to myself all day on YouTube, but I need things to talk about. So get to work. Anyway, so the Saturnian system is going to start to go through chaos. The planetary bodies within that system, in the Saturnian system, are going to start to experience all kinds of very interesting cataclysmic events. You're going to start to get earthquakes. You are going to start to see electrical discharges passing between bodies. You're going to start to see some stuff like that. So the sky is changing, everything is going to hell, everybody's shifting orbits. Now, how does the Earth survive all of these orbital shifts? You're probably wondering, good question, by the way, if you've been wondering this, how does Earth survive through all of this stuff if we are not orbiting a stable star, right? Because right now, everybody's been programmed to believe that there's this perfect Goldilocks zone around a star, and if you go anywhere outside of that, you can't exist. We have no scientific evidence that that is the case. That is purely a hypothetical made up by mainstream. There is no science to support that as an actual claim. So it's entirely possible that a planetary body could be, kicked way away from its solar system or from its, host star and still maintain itself, in the middle of space. I'm not going to get crazy with that because there's other reasons why Earth survives. But electromagnetism really does go a long way into potentially helping planetary bodies survive without a star. Depending on the Birkeland current that's flowing through that planetary body at that time, in theory, the Birkeland current could supply the heat to keep life alive. Now, daylight might be a little bit of a different situation, but anyway, you could potentially have a nighttime planet full of life in the middle of nowhere being powered by a Birkeland current. That's entirely possible. Anyway, that's kind of what happens here, but probably not really. Probably a little bit. Okay, anyway, let's keep going. Okay, so as the two solar systems are starting to destabilize, what's going to start to happen is that all of their makeup is going to change as they adapt to their new electrical environment. The nature of this adaptation is just, standard scientific garbage. But if you're a human living on Earth, it's going to be some of the most nightmarish garbage you've ever experienced in your life. And it will ultimately lead to the death of probably 99% of the planet. I don't, that's not a real number. I don't know. I don't have a poll, but a lot of people died. Let's just say that. Speaking of everybody dying, that is what all of the mythologies say essentially happened. Now, I'm an idiot, and I probably did not make it very clear that the Noah story, for example, is the story of Saturn novaing. All right, so any story that has this exact kind of a flood story to where the god essentially decides to wipe out all of mankind on the planet and introduces a flood that covers the whole planet, that is the flood that we are going to be talking about. Please remember, there's another ultra flood situation that happens to the planet, and while it does absolutely destroy a huge chunk of it, it's a completely different flood. What you will find when you go and you try to study flood stories, and pay attention to this, and I'll do a show on this later. I keep wanting to do it. Is that, mainstream alternative people who are willing to believe the flood story, of which there's just tons of evidence for now, by the way. And remember, it has nothing to do with God. Everything I've talked about so far, no God needed, all science, all cosmology. We don't need a God. So, a flood can happen just through science. We don't need any of that, and I'll explain that in a second. But anyway, when you're going and you're doing your flood research, what I'm seeing nowadays is that the alternative mainstream, they're grabbing basically every flood story they can find on the planet and just throwing it all into the exact same flood. If you do that, you have already lost. Do not do that. There are two different flood situations. When you find a culture talking about a flood that covered the planet, that's your Noah flood. That's, it covered the highest mountain. That is the deluge. Let's just use the term deluge, or for the, Utnapishtim's flood. Everybody has a flood story. I'm just using Noah because most people in the West are familiar with the Noah story. So I'm just going to say that. But hey, let's use deluge to just stay neutral. So just remember that when you guys are doing your flood story research. Okay. And make sure you separate them. Okay. And I'll just say what it is. The Saturnian flood is the Noah flood. The other floods, like the mountain of water described by people in North and South America, that's the Venus event. Completely different flood, quote unquote, horrific. Well, anyway, two different events. So just keep that in mind. Do not fall in that trap where you just see the word flood in history and just throw it all together into one flood and then think our ancestors are monkeys. So, they're all describing the same thing. They're just stupid. Don't do that. That's what mainstream people do. Do not become one of those people. That's like the worst thing you could do in your life. So it's important. So it's going to be important for us to actually be able to take the deluge seriously. So let's establish that really fast. Earth during this particular time period did not have the kind of mountains that we see nowadays. In fact, it had none of the geography that we see nowadays, or the topography, if you will. Earth back during this period of time was much more likely to be a smoother surfaced planet. Not only that, but we did not have the oceans of water that we do now. The oceans will come later, and we'll get to that in a second. So if we have a planet, if our planet was essentially more of a uniform smoothness, and let's just say the highest peak was like, I don't know, 1,000 feet, maybe 2,000 max, if I'm being generous. If that's the highest mountain, and there's only a few of them, suddenly filling the entire planet with water up to the highest peak becomes easily done, because now we're not contending with deep ocean basins. Mountains are not 20,000 plus feet high. We don't have any of that. If you want to cover a relatively flat surface with water, you can now do it, or at least you can do it more easily. Right now, if you are trying to figure out how Noah's flood could have existed with today's geology and topography, it's impossible, and I agree with that. This is the major mistake that everybody keeps making. Don't forget, our ancestors record a period of time, and this takes place after the deluge, by the way, when they watch and witness all of the mountains on this planet being ripped up and sent, tens of thousands of feet into the sky. They all record this. So if we look back at just the history of our ancestors, we can say, yeah, mountains in the way that we know them now did not exist back then. Even more interesting, and maybe more important if you want, the science also suggests and more or less proves right now, the geographical and geological science shows and proves that mountains, all the mountains on this planet right now, are all extremely fresh and new. And I mean all of the mountain ranges. It's funny, the deeper you dig into the geology of all the mountain ranges, you find eventually geologists shrugging and going, I don't know, dude, they're all brand new essentially. It appears they're only a few thousand years old, because that is ultimately what the science says. Now, generally in mainstream, they ignore all of that evidence and they still try to say that everything is millions of years old. Of course, they have no proof for any of that at the end of the day. Anyway, and for those of you who want to know where the mountains came from really fast, well, remember I said all of our ancestors recorded the event that created the mountains. This event would be known as the Venus event. This is the period of time that comes after the deluge, to where another planetary body, Venus, in comet mode, does a few flybys of Earth, and one of the flybys that it does is horrifically destructive, and it literally twists the planet. And one of the outcomes of this twisting, of this torsion movement, is the fact that mountains are raised. And of course, continents sink as well. So essentially, after the Venus event, Earth is completely different than what it was before. So we cannot look at Earth right now. We cannot look at the geography of Earth and be like, oh yeah, we're going to use all this to try to figure out what happened in the past. It's impossible. You will never make sense of any of the science or any of the history if you make the mistake of trying to fit in the ancient stories with today's modern topography. It's never going to happen, and there's no reason to believe that anyways, or there's no reason to do that anyways, because our ancestors explain what happened throughout history. So if any historians or researchers or scientists or whatever out there who are trying to figure out what happened in the past, if you are using modern day topography and trying to fit those stories in there, you will never succeed. It'll be literally impossible. And this is one of the reasons why we have so many problems with respect to history. Everybody has been led to believe, well, not everybody, most people buy into the theory of uniformity. So everybody thinks that Earth has been like Earth for, millions and billions of years. Nothing could be further from the truth. Okay, so Earth is a much more smoother body. Next thing you could say to me is, well, dude, prove it. I mean, how do you even get to that point? I mean, do you have any evidence for that? Yes, we have tons of geological evidence, but let me take it one step further. If we look at a planet like Venus, which scientists always call Earth's twin, which it's not Earth's twin at all, it's completely stupid. But anyway, if you look at Venus, we find that that planet does not have any real mountainous terrain. It's nothing like Earth. It's a very relatively smooth body. We also find that on Titan as well, and several other planets and moons and stuff like that out there. We find situations to where there are planetoids or moons that essentially have very little in the way of mountainous terrain, and they don't really have all that many impact craters. In fact, for example, Venus, I mean, it's, scientists try to say that Venus is like, hundreds of millions of years old and it's been sitting there. But when you look at the surface of Venus, you find that it is rather clear, relatively speaking, of craters. The reason why this is a problem for mainstream cosmologists is because mainstream cosmologists crater count to get ages of planets. That's literally how they decide how old a planet is. They count the amount of craters on the surface of a planet, and then they average it out over millions of years about how many, asteroids or comets or whatever would have hit the body over millions of years, and then they just factor that out and they get a number. That is the dumbest way you could ever age something in your entire life. It's not science. It's literally just a hypothetical trash that has been translated into fact in the mainstream. So, the reason why Venus is important, and that'll come into the next show probably, is because Venus is a relatively new planet. All right? And Venus, while it did go through its own hell, it did not go through the exact same hell as Earth. Basically, what Venus's existence does for us is that it shows us, and other, moons as well out there, it shows us that planets can exist with a relatively smooth surface, and it should be expected. And the dating system doesn't work either, so any way that we try to date any of the planetary objects out there, they all fail. So if you're gonna try to deal with millions and billions of years, you don't need any of that because none of that is established fact. So we can get rid of all that crap. Okay, anyway, so Earth would have been a completely different looking world, and it would have been a lush world as well. Don't forget that. I remember when I was going to try and only make all of my shows 20 minutes. All right, it takes an hour just to get to the point now. All right, so let's get to the point of this episode. So we have these two solar systems now electrically interacting, and they are starting to essentially rip each other apart while they're acclimating to their new environment. What happens with Saturn, with our brown dwarf Saturn, is that as it's getting all of its charge pulled away and messed with in this, basically a car accident in space, it is going to react in all kinds of different ways to the charge potential changing. One of the ways that a brown dwarf star reacts to an electrical change in its environment is that it novas. Now, mainstream agrees with this as well, by the way, so this is not weird even for them. The only weird thing is all the other stuff that we've kind of been talking about. Anyway, we have precedents for it, so this is not made up. This is real science. Saturn novaed while Earth was close by. Now, when most people think of a nova, everybody just thinks of the supernovas that, are huge, bright explosions out there, and, you can see it's brighter than a galaxy and blah, blah, blah. That's what everybody thinks, right? And if you were close by that and you were a planet, would you survive that? Depending on how close you are, probably not. Earth was still relatively close to Saturn during this particular period of time. But with Saturn being a brown dwarf star, and depending on how it novas, right? We don't know the exact energy potential and how exactly it novaed. We just know that it novaed, and we know that we survived. So those pieces of evidence suggest that the nova was, while powerful and absolutely did damage to everything around it, it was not a planet obliterating situation. So when Saturn novas, obviously there is going to be one hell of a blast of energy. And I would imagine that anybody who was looking at Saturn at this point in time was probably immediately blinded permanently because the bright flash would have been insane. This bright flash is also recorded in all kinds of deluge stories. Anyways, Saturn novas, bright flash. When a brown dwarf star novas, what it's doing is that it's essentially shedding matter to try and acclimate to its charge. So you're going to get a burst of energy. Along with that burst, along with that shedding of matter, some of the matter that it sheds is, interestingly enough, water. Now this, like I already said earlier in the show, has also been proven even by mainstream cosmologists. When brown dwarfs flare, they shed water. What do you think is going to happen to a planet in the way of essentially a star explosion size of water? You are going to get rainstorms from hell. Suddenly, the deluge starts to make scientific sense. Now, the deluge stories are generally told in a situation of humans and giants and other wicked things being punished, but everybody agrees that masses of water rained down from the sky because of this event. Scientifically speaking, if we have a smoother Earth and we have a star-sized explosion of water now raining down on Earth, we can now have the entire planet be flooded by water up to the highest peak. Now when we go and we look at the deluge story, suddenly it's no longer a product of mythology. Suddenly it's no longer some sort of weird legend that was made up by our ancestors. Suddenly, all of the stuff that they recorded, even though it sounded insane to us today, now starts to make scientific sense. When Saturn novas, it pushes Earth away from it. Definitely does that. But while it's doing that, it's also blasting Earth with a nova-sized rain shower, essentially, from hell. Earth is going to experience rain for weeks. Now, the famous time frame for the rain coming down all over the planet is 40 days and 40 nights. And it's interesting to note that other cultures around the planet agree with that time frame, and other cultures have kind of a different time frame as well, and that's fine. What that says to me as a researcher is that we don't really know the true amount of time that passed that Earth was rained down upon. And one of the reasons why we probably for sure have no idea is simple. If Earth was not orbiting the sun, we probably did not have a 24-hour cycle. Or not probably, we did not. We were not in our clockwork solar system that we're in now. So timekeeping back then, well, A, never existed because there was no way to keep time if you were inside of a plasma sheath. B, there would be no reason to do it anyway because everybody was happy and having fun all day in their Garden of Eden in the Golden Age. So there was no reason to build a clock because who cares, right? You can't tell time if you're in a stationary orbit within a brown dwarf. There's no reason to anyway, like I said. So where does the 40 days and 40 nights come from? I don't know. That might actually just be kind of made up. That could be extrapolated from something else. You know, and the other dates that other cultures have, or I should say the time frames that other cultures have, do they have the real date relative to how we look at time now? You know, who knows? Because back in the day, the calendar in the sense that it exists now did not exist back then. Hell, even the calendar systems that existed like 1,000 years ago were completely different than what exists today. Because remember, we did not always have a 365-day year. We used to have a 360-day year. We used to have, a 240-day for a little bit as well. The time frames are all messed up. So when we start to talk about how long Earth was rained down upon, ultimately, I don't know. The only thing that we can come out with and say is that it couldn't have been, it certainly was not centuries, right? And it might have been a year. I don't know. It could have been 2 weeks. Hell, it could have been 1 week for all we know. The problem is that we don't know the true amount of time, and we may never know that either because we have no real relative way of tracking time relative to how those people would have looked at time and how those people would have communicated their version of time and then translated it down the time to us relative to our current calendar. You see how screwed we are as researchers? Okay. Anyway, Saturn novas. Earth gets rained down upon, and this is where humanity really starts to begin. Humanity that we today are more familiar with. All right, we'll leave it at that. I think we finally got to the nova part after an hour. Holy. All right, I'll do better next time. We'll cut out the recap, or at least the insane recap in the next show. All right, so we'll leave it at that. Earth right now has been ejected by Saturn novaing because Saturn has run into the binary solar system of the Sun-Jupiter system. Those two electromagnetic fields are now talking to each other, and everybody is shedding charge to acclimate to their environment. If you are a human living on Earth, you better be able to swim, boy, because damn, that water's deep.